As Officer Mark Reed settled into his favorite corner booth at the small cafe that evening, all he wanted was a quiet beer before heading home to celebrate his wedding anniversary. When he first noticed the elderly woman in a faded hospital gown, clearly needing medical attention, he told himself it wasn't his problem. He was off duty after all. But when she entered the cafe and walked straight towards him, what she whispered made his blood run cold. After hearing her words and uncovering the truth, he was faced with a dark situation that forced him to call for backup. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Mark Reed pushed open the door of the Copper Kettle Cafe, ready to unwind after another long day on patrol. The familiar warmth of his favorite evening spot was a welcome change from Ridgeway's cooling streets. The cafe's interior was warm and inviting, with its dimly lit ambiance and the soft clinking of cups against saucers providing a welcome respite from the outside world. Mark's eyes instinctively scanned the room, taking in the cozy, worn leather booths and rustic decor that had become a source of comfort over the years. The walls were adorned with vintage copper kettles and old photographs of Ridgeway, giving the place a sense of history and belonging. He made his way to his usual corner booth, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on his shoulders. As he sank into the cracked leather seat, the familiar texture beneath him offered a small measure of solace. Mark couldn't help but let out a weary sigh. Today had been particularly demanding, both mentally and physically. He had responded to a domestic dispute that had escalated quickly, requiring all of his experience and patience to diffuse. Then there was the paperwork, endless forms and reports that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Settling into the booth, Mark pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his tired face. A message from Julia, his wife, caught his attention immediately. "Don't forget, dinner at 8 p.m. for our anniversary, love you." The reminder of their wedding anniversary dinner brought a mix of emotions, warmth at the thought of spending time with Julia, but also a twinge of guilt for almost forgetting such an important occasion. Mark quickly typed out a reply, "I'll be home soon to change, love you too." He set the phone down and signaled to the waitress, ordering his usual, a cold beer to take the edge off the day. "I'm on my way home from work, can't wait to see you." He read the reply from Julia, just at the arrival of his beer. A fleeting smile crossed Mark's face as he read her words. Despite the exhaustion, he felt a surge of anticipation for the evening ahead. Taking a long sip of his beer, Mark savored the cold, crisp taste. He knew he shouldn't linger too long. He needed to get home and change for dinner. But the allure of a few moments of peace was too strong to resist. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his earphones and plugged them into his phone. Scrolling through his playlist, he selected a video and turned up the volume, momentarily muting the world outside. In this cocoon of sound and familiar surroundings, Mark felt the day's stresses slowly ebbing away. As Mark became increasingly absorbed in his video, the world outside the Copper Kettle Cafe continued its quiet evening rhythm. It was in this seemingly ordinary moment that something caught Mark's peripheral vision, a movement outside the partially obscured window with its blurred screen. Instinctively, Mark's eyes flicked towards the source of the movement. Through the partially obscured window with a blurred screen, he could make out the figure of an elderly woman standing unsteadily on the cracked walkway outside. Even from a distance, there was something about her appearance that gave Mark pause. The woman was wearing what looked like a faded pink gown, or was it a hospital scrub, he wondered. Her gaunt frame seemed to sway slightly in the gentle evening breeze, hinting at a fragility that immediately stirred Mark's concern. As he focused more intently on her, he could see that her thin, frail form appeared almost spectral in the dim streetlight. Her expression, even from this distance, seemed distant and confused. For a brief moment, Mark felt a surge of professional instinct. His years as a police officer had honed his ability to spot potential trouble. The woman's appearance and demeanor ticked several boxes in his mental checklist of concerning situations. However, as quickly as the thought arose, Mark pushed it aside. He reminded himself firmly that he was off duty, This was his time to unwind, to prepare for his anniversary dinner with Julia. Surely, if there was a real problem, someone else would handle it. With a slight shake of his head, as if to physically dispel his concerns, Mark looked back at his phone. The video was still playing. He took another sip of his beer. Not my problem right now, he thought to himself, trying to refocus on his moment of peace. But fate had different intentions for Mark that evening. Just as he was beginning to relax in his brief moment of respite, the commotion of a crowd gathering outside caught his attention. Almost reflexively, Mark stood up to get a clearer view, despite being off duty. He noticed the elderly woman he had observed earlier had fallen to the ground. Within moments, as Mark took in the scene, he saw someone reaching out to assist her. For a moment, Mark stood frozen, caught between his instinct to help and his desire to remain uninvolved. He tried to convince himself that it might just be a minor incident. Perhaps the woman had simply tripped, and those people around her had helped her up. There was no need for him to intervene, he reasoned. After all, he was off duty, and he had his own plans for the evening. Mark turned up the volume on his phone higher, focusing back on his screen. This, combined with the muffling effect of the cafe's atmosphere, meant that he was completely unaware of the approaching ambulance siren. The flashing blue and red lights, which would normally have immediately caught his attention, were blurred by the screen on the window and the dimly lit interior of the café. A waitress approached his table and patted his shoulder. Her face showed a mix of concern and curiosity as she leaned in to speak to Mark. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice barely audible over the music in his earphones. "I noticed your uniform. Aren't you a police officer? There seems to be some trouble outside." Mark hesitated for a moment before responding. He could feel the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. "I'm off duty right now," he said reluctantly, gauging the look on the young woman's face. "But I'll go check it out just to be sure everything's okay." Mark stood up. He left his beer on the table and made his way to the cafe's entrance, his mind already shifting into professional mode, despite his initial reluctance. By the time Mark reached the door and stepped outside, the scene had changed. The crowd that had gathered was now dispersing, and there was no sign of the elderly woman. In the distance, he could see the retreating lights of an ambulance, its siren fading as it turned a corner and disappeared from view. It seemed that the situation had been handled without his intervention. The woman must have been taken to the hospital, he reasoned, and was now in capable hands. With this reassurance, Mark turned and walked back to his booth. Mark had just settled back into his seat, lifting his phone to continue watching the video he had started earlier, when the cafe door swung open, the little bell above it chiming. To Mark's utter astonishment, the elderly woman he had seen outside earlier stepped into the cafe. He looked around, but the waitress who would normally greet new customers was nowhere to be seen, likely tending to tasks in the back room or pantry. Mark's eyes widened in confusion. He thought that the ambulance had taken her away. Yet here she was, standing just inside the doorway of the Copper Kettle Cafe. The warm lighting of the cafe cast a harsh contrast on her fragile frame, making her appear even more skeletal than she had looked through the blurred window earlier. As she stood there, Mark could see her thin hands trembling, her fingers moving restlessly as if searching for something to grasp. Her eyes, set deep in her gaunt face, held a haunting mix of exhaustion and confusion. There was something in her gaze that spoke of a deep, unspoken pain. He watched the woman making her way in. At first, it seemed like she was looking for an empty seat, but Mark noticed she was walking in the direction of his booth. As she drew closer, he could hear her muttering under her breath fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense. "Too late," she whispered, her voice raspy and urgent. "It's too late." Mark's confusion deepened, but his training took over. He straightened up, meeting the woman's gaze. "Ma'am," he said, "are you all right? Do you need help?" He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm a police officer. Are you in any danger?" The woman's demeanor changed abruptly at his words. Her eyes, which had been darting around the cafe nervously, suddenly focused on Mark with startling clarity. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer. though still tinged with an undercurrent of distress. "I'm Laura Hawthorne." She leaned closer and whispered to him, her words coming out in a rush. "Can you help me end what they should have done in the hospital?" Mark felt a chill run down his spine at her words. What did she mean by end, and who were they? His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had. "Ms. Hawthorne," he began cautiously, "what do you mean? Are you looking for the hospital?" But before Mark could ask any more questions, Laura's demeanor shifted once again. The brief moment of lucidity vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Her expression went blank, her eyes losing focus. She began to mutter unintelligibly and backed away from his booth. Her movements were jerky, and without another word she turned and walked out of the cafe. For a moment Mark sat frozen in his seat, trying to process what had just happened. Why did the woman enter the cafe in the first place? Why did she look so confused and lost? Is she in any danger? He mused. The encounter had been so brief, so surreal, that part of him wondered if he had imagined it. But the lingering scent of antiseptic that clung to Laura's scrub, and the echo of her desperate words in his ears, told him something was wrong with the woman, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to follow her, to make sure she was safe. With a heavy sigh, Mark pulled out his phone to send a quick text to Julia. "Something's come up, might be a little late. I'll explain everything later. I love you." He hit send, hoping Julia would understand, even as guilt gnawed at him for potentially ruining their anniversary plans. Then, leaving his half-finished beer on the table, Mark headed for the cafe door. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, he scanned the street, looking for any sign of Laura. He spotted her across the road, her pink hospital gown a stark contrast against the darkening sky. When the pedestrian light turned green, Mark set off after her, his pace quick but measured. He didn't want to alarm her by running, but he also didn't want to lose sight of her in the growing darkness. With each step, the streets of Ridgeway grew increasingly silent, casting an unsettling shadow over the familiar scenes of his hometown. Mark kept a cautious distance behind the woman, not wanting to startle her. Suddenly, a painful memory surfaced. It was his mother in her final days, struggling against the grip of dementia. He recalled her frail figure in the hospital bed, her once bright eyes dulled with confusion and fear. One harrowing moment stood out. Her mother had pleaded with the doctors to end her suffering, her eyes filled with a haunting desperation that lingered with Mark. Could that be what Laura had meant when she whispered that they should have let it end in the hospital? The thought hit Mark like a physical blow, nearly causing him to stumble. He could see echoes of his mother in Laura's confused state, in her cryptic words about endings and her plea for help. This realization solidified his resolve. He couldn't turn back now, couldn't leave Laura to face whatever troubles plagued her alone. The well-maintained houses and manicured lawns of the town centre gave way to a more neglected part of Ridgeway as he trailed behind her. Mark's police instincts kicked into high gear as he took in his surroundings. He knew this area well. It was a part of town that had fallen on hard times, where abandoned properties stood alongside homes, struggling to maintain a semblance of dignity. It was a place where desperation often led to crime, where his fellow officers were called more frequently than in other parts of Ridgeway. Where is the woman going? Was he walking into a situation far more complex and potentially dangerous than he could have imagined when he first decided to follow her? Mark's hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his service weapon would normally be holstered. Its absence was a stark reminder that he was off duty, unprepared for whatever situation might unfold. He silently berated himself for not calling for backup before following Laura, but he knew that if he stopped to make that call now, he risked losing sight of her in these shadowy streets. Laura's meandering path through the poorer neighborhood finally came to an end as she stopped in front of a rundown house. Mark, still maintaining his distance, took in the scene before him with a growing sense of unease. The house stood as a testament to years of neglect, its once proud facade now a shadow of its former self. The yard was a chaotic mess, strewn with broken furniture and rusted cans. Weeds grew unchecked, pushing through cracks in the concrete pathway that led to the front door. The house itself was in a sorry state, its paint peeling in large strips, revealing weathered wood underneath. Mark's police instincts were on high alert as Laura reached the front steps, ready to intervene if necessary. But before she could climb the worn stairs, the front door creaked open. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night, causing Mark to instinctively reach for a weapon that wasn't there. From the darkened doorway emerged a young man, his appearance as disheveled and worn as the house itself. Even from a distance, Mark could see that the man was unsteady on his feet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. As the man stepped into the dim light cast by a nearby street lamp, Mark's trained eye quickly picked up on the telltale signs of drug addiction: the gaunt face, the nervous twitches, and most damning of all, the track marks visible on his arms. The young man's voice, slurred and angry, shattered the night's silence. "Mother, you're a killer. You killed father," he shouted, his words echoing down the empty street. Mark felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Mother? This young addict was Laura's son. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far more complex and heartbreaking than Mark had anticipated. Laura, seemingly galvanized by her son's accusation, tried to approach him. "No, no, no, he's inside, he's alive," she repeated, her voice a mixture of desperation and denial. But in her haste, her frail body betrayed her. She stumbled, losing her balance on the uneven ground. Mark's body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. He sprinted forward, hoping to catch Laura before she hit the ground, but he was too far away and could only watch in horror as she fell hard onto the concrete of the pathway. As Mark reached Laura's side, kneeling beside her fallen form, he was acutely aware of the young man's reaction. The sound of the front door slamming shut and the click of a lock being hastily engaged told Mark that the son had retreated into the house, likely spooked by his sudden appearance in a police uniform. Mark's attention, however, was fully focused on Laura. He gently rolled her onto her back, his eyes scanning for any signs of serious injury. To his relief, it appeared that while she would likely have some nasty bruises on her legs and arms, she hadn't suffered any broken bones or head trauma from the fall. "Ms. Hawthorne," Mark said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "Laura, can you hear me? I was a police officer. You spoke to me at the café." Laura's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Her lips moved, but the words that came out were barely above a whisper. "We're good people." The cryptic nature of her words sent a chill down Mark's spine. What did she mean? What had happened in this house, in this family, to bring them to this point? Realizing that the situation was beyond what he could handle alone, Mark knew it was time to call for backup. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving automatically as he dialed the familiar number for dispatch. "This is Officer Mark Reed," he said as soon as the call connected. "I need an ambulance and police backup at—" He quickly rattled off the address, his eyes never leaving Laura's face as he spoke. "I have an elderly woman who's fallen and may be injured. There's also a possible drug situation on the premises." As he ended the call, Mark could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching. Help was on the way, but as he looked between the still form of Laura on the ground and the dark, forbidding house where her son had disappeared, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult night. The quiet neighborhood, which had seemed so oppressive just moments ago, now buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as Mark waited for his fellow officers and the paramedics to arrive. The wail of sirens grew louder as Mark knelt beside Laura, his training kicking in as he assessed her condition. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and while she seemed dazed, she was at least conscious. Mark gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to provide some comfort while also ensuring she didn't try to move. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you hear me? Do you feel any pain in your body?" His voice was calm and professional, but inside his mind was racing with questions and concerns. Laura's response was barely audible, her words coming out in a confused mumble. We're good people. I didn't kill anybody. My husband's inside. She repeated the phrase, her eyes unfocused and distant. Mark's brow furrowed with concern. The young man earlier had called her mother, and he was too young to be her husband. The cryptic nature of her words, combined with the earlier outburst from the young man, painted a troubling picture. What had happened to this family? What secrets lay hidden behind the peeling paint and boarded-up windows of their home? Before Mark could ponder further, the night erupted into a flurry of activity. An ambulance rounded the corner, its lights painting the dilapidated houses in alternating flashes of red and white. Close behind came the police cruiser, their arrival announced by the crunch of tires on the debris-strewn street. Danny and Connor, two of his fellow officers he'd worked with countless times before, emerged from the car. Their familiar faces brought a sense of relief. He knew he could count on their support and expertise. The paramedics were the first to reach Mark and Laura, their movements swift and practiced as they began to assess her condition. Mark stood up, giving them room to work, and turned to brief his colleagues. "Danny, Connor," he nodded to each of them in turn. "We've got a complex situation here. The woman is Laura Hawthorne. She collapsed outside, and I followed her here. Her son is inside the house. He appeared intoxicated and possibly under the influence of drugs. He retreated inside when he saw me." Connor's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the house. "Any weapons that you know of?" Mark shook his head. "Unknown. I haven't been inside, and I only saw the son briefly. But given the state of the house and his apparent drug use, we should proceed with caution." Danny nodded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What do you want us to do, Mark?" Despite being off duty, Mark found himself naturally falling into a leadership role. "Connor, Danny, I need you to secure the house and the son. Approach with caution. He seemed agitated earlier. If you can, try to bring him out peacefully. We need to figure out what's going on here." As his fellow officers moved towards the house, Mark turned his attention back to Laura and the paramedics. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, was speaking softly to Laura as her partner prepared the stretcher. "Ma'am, we're going to take you to the hospital now," the paramedic was saying. "We need to make sure you're not hurt from your fall." Laura's eyes widened in panic at the mention of the hospital. No cop," she muttered, weakly trying to resist as they began to lift her onto the stretcher. "I'm not a bad person. We didn't hurt anyone." Mark stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Laura, it's okay. They're here to help you. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." As the paramedics secured Laura on the stretcher, Mark made a quick decision. "I'm going to ride with her to the hospital," he called out to Danny and Connor. "Keep me updated on the situation here." The younger paramedic nodded, seemingly relieved to have a police officer accompanying them. As they loaded Laura into the ambulance, Mark climbed in after them, his mind whirling with questions and theories about what had led to this night's events. Her earlier words echoed in his mind. "We're good people. Spare him." What did it mean? As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to move, Mark found himself studying Laura's face. In the harsh light of the ambulance interior, she looked even more frail and vulnerable than before. The paramedic's voice broke through Mark's thoughts. "Sir, did you know the patient before tonight?" Mark shook his head. "No, I encountered her for the first time this evening. She seemed confused, possibly suffering from dementia. Do you know anything about her medical history?" The paramedic's expression turned thoughtful. "Actually, it's a bit of a strange situation. We received a call earlier today about a missing patient from Ridgeway General, an elderly woman who had wandered off. When we arrived at the location given, she was already gone. I think this might be the same woman." Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "She escaped from the hospital. When was this?" "Yesterday," the paramedic replied. "They've been searching for her since then." A wave of guilt washed over Mark as he remembered seeing the ambulance outside the café earlier. If only he had paid more attention and gotten involved sooner. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the present. "I saw an ambulance outside the café where I first noticed her," Mark admitted. "I thought, I thought they had taken her then. I didn't realize. The paramedic gave him a sympathetic look. It's not your fault, officer. These situations can be confusing. The important thing is that we've found her now and can get her the help she needs. As the ambulance sped through the quiet streets of Ridgeway, Mark found himself lost in thought. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but he sensed that there was still much more to uncover. The image of the dilapidated house, Laura's confused ramblings, and her son's angry accusation all swirled in his mind. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance of Ridgeway General Hospital. The back doors burst open, and a flurry of activity ensued as the paramedics efficiently transferred Laura from the ambulance to a waiting gurney. Mark followed behind, his eyes never leaving Laura's frail form. As they wheeled her through the automatic doors and into the bright antiseptic environment of the ER. The sudden change in surroundings seemed to disorient her further, and she began to mutter, "End his pain, please. My husband's alive but in pain," she pleaded, her thin fingers grasping at the air. "We are good people, officer. Please believe me." Mark's heart clenched at the desperation in her voice. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be all right, but he knew that would be premature. There was still so much about her situation that he didn't understand. A team of nurses and a doctor quickly gathered around Laura's gurney, their voices a calm counterpoint to her distressed cries. They began checking her vitals and assessing the bruises from her fall, their movements swift and practiced. "She needs to be sedated," one of the nurses said, reaching for a syringe. Mark stepped forward, his police instincts kicking in. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "Is it possible to calm her without putting her to sleep? I need to talk to her if possible." The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked at Mark appraisingly. "Officer?" "Reed," Mark supplied. "Mark Reed." The doctor nodded. "Officer Reed, I'm Dr. Patel. We'll do our best to keep her calm and conscious, but her well-being is our primary concern. We'll administer a mild sedative to take the edge off her anxiety without knocking her out completely." Mark nodded his thanks, stepping back to allow the medical team to work. As they tended to Laura, administering the sedative and checking her for injuries, a nurse approached Mark. "Officer Reed, I have some information about Mrs. Hawthorne that might be helpful." Mark turned his full attention to the nurse, eager for any details that might help him understand the situation better. "Laura Hawthorne was admitted to our hospital 3 days ago along with her husband, Mr. Charles Hawthorne," the nurse began. "They were involved in a car accident. Mr. Hawthorne, he didn't make it. He passed away 2 days ago." Mark felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. Suddenly, Laura's confused state and her cryptic words about endings took on a new, heartbreaking context. The nurse continued, her voice low and compassionate. "Mrs. Hawthorne was devastated, of course. She's been diagnosed with severe cardiovascular disease and early-stage dementia. The shock of losing her husband, well, it seems to have pushed her into a state of confusion and delusion. She kept insisting that her husband was still alive but suffering, and that she needed to end it for him." Mark's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information. "And she escaped yesterday?" he asked, recalling what the paramedic had told him. The nurse nodded. "Yes, she somehow managed to slip out unnoticed. We've been searching for her since then. We were worried sick, especially given her medical condition." As Mark processed this information, he glanced over at Laura. The sedative seemed to be taking effect. Her cries had subsided to soft murmurs, and her body had relaxed somewhat on the gurney. Dr. Patel was speaking to her in low, soothing tones as she examined the bruises from Laura's fall. Mark's phone suddenly buzzed in his pocket. Excusing himself, he stepped away from the gurney to answer the call. It was from Julia. "Mark, where are you? Is everything okay? I'm worried." Her tone filled with concern. Guilt washed over him as he realized how much time had passed. Their anniversary dinner, the plans they'd made, it all seemed so distant now, overshadowed by the unfolding drama of Laura Hawthorne's story. I'm so sorry, Julia. Something unexpected came up. An elderly woman, she came to me in distress, introducing herself as Laura Hawthorne while I was at the cafe earlier. I'm at the hospital now, it's complicated, but I promise I'll explain everything. He struggled to find the right words to explain the situation. How could he convey the complexity of what was happening, the pull he felt to see this through, without sounding like he was prioritizing work over their relationship, especially on their anniversary? Mark, you said her name's Laura Hawthorne, an elderly woman. Julia's voice urgent and concerned. Surprised by the question, Mark replied, Yes, that's her name. Do you know her? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Julia spoke again, her voice was filled with a mix of emotions, concern, sadness, and a hint of determination. I'm not sure, Mark, but I'm coming to the hospital. I'm nearby. I'll explain when I get there, but I think I know her, or knew her, a long time ago. Just wait for me there, okay? Before Mark could respond, Julia had hung up. He stared at his phone, bewildered by this unexpected turn of events. How did Julia know Laura Hawthorne? And what connection could she possibly have to this tragic situation? As these questions swirled in his mind, Mark's phone buzzed once more with a message from Connor. He quickly opened it, hoping for more clarity on the situation at the Hawthorne house. Mark, we've secured the premises. The young man, identified as Jason Hawthorne, is in custody. He's clearly under the influence and not very cooperative. Looks like he hasn't been home in a while, just showed up recently. Neighbors say they hadn't seen him in months until a couple of days ago. Mark's brow furrowed as he processed this new information. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, painting a picture of a family torn apart by addiction, illness, and tragedy. Update. Jason is confirmed to be Laura and Charles's son. Only came back after seeing news of his parents' accident. That's why we didn't encounter him during the initial investigation. He's been struggling with addiction for years. We have him now at the station, safe with us. As Mark reflected on this newfound insight, his eyes shifted back to Laura. The sedative had taken full effect, and she appeared more at peace. Her eyelids fluttered, opening and closing slowly, as if caught between awareness and sleep. These thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, who approached Mark. Officer Reed, she said quietly, I've reviewed Ms. Hawthorne's medical history. Her condition is complex. The dementia, while still in its early stages, is clearly affecting her ability to process recent events, and the cardiovascular issues are a serious concern, especially given the stress she's been under. Mark nodded, processing this information. What's the prognosis, Doctor? Dr. Patel sighed, her professional demeanor softening slightly. It's hard to say for certain. With proper care and support, she could have several good years ahead of her, but she'll need a stable environment, regular medical attention, and most importantly, understanding and patience from those around her. The doctor continued, Ms. Hawthorne is calm enough now if you'd like to speak with her, but please keep it brief, she needs rest. Mark approached the gurney, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. Laura's eyes focused on him as he drew near. Laura, he said gently, do you remember me? I'm Officer Reed. We met earlier this evening at the cafe and you spoke to... Laura nodded slowly, her gaze drifting between Mark and the hospital room around them. Officer, she whispered, her voice hoarse, Did you end it? Is Charles at peace now? Mark felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain to this grieving, confused woman that her husband had already passed away? That her mind, clouded by dementia and grief, had created a false reality where she still needed to save him. But before he could respond, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. He turned to see Julia rushing towards him. Seeing Julia in this unexpected setting, the sterile hospital hallway, with the beeping of machines and the hushed voices of medical staff in the background, brought home to Mark just how much this situation had upended their plans for the evening. Yet, as she drew closer, he saw in her eyes not anger or disappointment, but a fierce compassion that made his heart swell with love and admiration. Mark, Julia said as she reached him, slightly out of breath. "I'm here. I want to see her." Mark, still trying to process Julia's possible connection to Laura, gestured towards the curtained-off area where Laura lay. "She's calm now, but Julia, how do you know her? What's going on?" Julia took a deep breath, her eyes filling with a mix of emotions. Sadness, nostalgia, and something that looked like determination. "It's a long story, Mark, but if this is the Laura Hawthorne I think it is, well, let's just say she played a significant role in our lives, in our son's life especially." Mark's confusion must have shown on his face, because Julia reached out and squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I'll explain everything, I promise, but first, I need to know if it's really her." Mark nodded and made space for Julia to stand by the bedside. The hustle and bustle of the ER seemed to fade into the background. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft rustle of the curtain around Laura's bed created a cocoon of quiet around them. Laura lay still, her eyes drowsy and her breathing steady. Julia hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering just above Laura's, as if afraid that touching her might somehow break this surreal moment. "It's her," Julia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe it, but it's her." Mark watched as Julia's eyes filled with tears, a mix of recognition and sorrow playing across her face. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, silently encouraging her to continue. Julia took a deep breath, then gently placed her hand on Laura's. The touch seemed to stir something in Laura as she tried to focus on the faces before her. "Laura," Julia said softly, leaning in closer. "Laura, do you remember me? It's Julia, Alex's mom." At the mention of Alex's name, a spark of recognition flickered in Laura's eyes. She blinked several times as if trying to clear away the fog of confusion and medication. "Julia," Laura's voice was weak, but there was a note of wonder in it. "Little Alex's mother?" Julia nodded, a watery smile spreading across her face. "Yes, that's right. You used to be Alex's preschool teacher, do you remember?" Laura's brow furrowed in concentration, fragments of memories seemingly piecing themselves together in her mind. "Alex," she murmured. "Such a sweet boy, so full of energy." Mark watched this exchange with a mixture of amazement and confusion. He had known that Julia and Alex had lived in Ridgeway before he met them, but he had never imagined this connection to the woman at the center of tonight's events. Julia continued, her voice gentle and encouraging. "That's right, Laura. Alex was very active. He had a hyperactivity disorder, remember? You were so patient with him, even staying after school to help him." A faint smile touched Laura's lips. "I remember," she said softly. "He needed extra care, extra attention. Such a bright child." Mark could see the emotion welling up in Julia's eyes as she spoke. "Laura, I want you to know. I need you to know how much your kindness meant to us. You laid the foundation for Alex's education, gave him the confidence he needed. He's in secondary school now, doing so well, and it's in no small part thanks to you." Laura's eyes widened slightly at this news, a glimmer of pride shining through the confusion. "Secondary school? My, how time flies. Is he happy?" Julia nodded emphatically. "He is, Laura. He's thriving. And we've never forgotten the role you played in his early years, your patience, your understanding. It made all the difference." As Mark listened to this exchange, he felt a profound sense of the interconnectedness of lives. Here was Laura, a woman he had only met hours ago under the most bizarre circumstances, yet she had played a crucial role in shaping the life of his stepson. The world suddenly seemed both vastly large and incredibly small. Laura's gaze drifted to Mark, a question forming in her tired eyes. "And you, sir?" Mark stepped forward, taking Julia's free hand in his own. "I'm Mark, Julia's husband. I'm a police officer here in Ridgeway. I'm the one who found you earlier this evening." Recognition dawned on Laura's face. "Ah, yes, the kind officer. You were trying to help me, weren't you?" Mark nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yes, Laura, I still am. We all are." Laura's eyes filled with tears, her gaze moving between Mark and Julia. You're good people, she whispered. Just like Charles and I. We tried to be good people too. Julia squeezed Laura's hand gently. You are good people, Laura. You've touched so many lives and made such a difference. We're here to help you now, okay? Then please help me. Do me a favor, Laura whispered, her voice weak but laced with urgency. I want to see my husband now, while I'm still clear-headed. Can you ask the nurse to do me this favor? I need to say goodbye. I haven't seen him for days, even after they told me he passed away. Mark had hesitated, looking to Dr. Patel for guidance. The doctor had nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of professional concern and human compassion. It might provide some closure, she had said quietly. But someone should accompany her and we'll need to keep the visit brief. Do you understand? Yes, doctor, thank you, Laura replied, relief evident in her voice. The sterile hallways of the hospital seemed to stretch endlessly as Mark, Julia, and a nurse wheeled Laura towards the morgue. The rhythmic squeak of the wheelchair's wheels echoed in the quiet corridor, a somber soundtrack to their solemn journey. Now, as they approached the doors of the morgue, Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He glanced at Julia, who walked beside Laura's wheelchair, her hand resting gently on the older woman's shoulder. The morgue attendant, a kind-faced man with greying hair, met them at the entrance. He spoke in hushed tones with the nurse, nodding solemnly before leading them into the dimly lit room. The cool air of the morgue enveloped them as they entered, carrying with it the faint, clinical scent of disinfectant. Laura's eyes darted around the room, finally settling on a draped form on one of the tables. Her thin fingers trembled as she reached out, and Mark quickly moved to her side, ready to support her if needed. With practiced efficiency tinged with respect, the attendant gently pulled back the sheet, revealing Charles's face. In death he looked peaceful, the lines of worry and pain that had likely marked his final days smoothed away. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she gazed upon her husband's face. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she reached out, her trembling hand hovering just above Charles' lifeless one. "Oh, Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then turning to Mark with eyes that seemed to see him clearly for the first time, she spoke. "Sir, my husband's dead, and my son. My son is a mess." The raw honesty in her voice struck Mark to his core. He knelt beside her wheelchair, meeting her gaze. "It's true, Laura," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "Your husband is at peace now. He's not in pain anymore. The police have secured your son, and he's safe." Laura nodded, her gaze drifting back to Charles. "He was a good man," she said softly. "We tried our best, you know, but our boy, he lost his way, fell in with bad company." She sighed, a lifetime of worry and heartache contained in that single exhalation. "Charles always said to me, even in our hardest moments, 'I won't die until you do first, so you'll never have to live in this world alone in sorrow.'" A sad smile flickered across Laura's face. "Sometimes when my mind slips, I can hear him as if he's right next to me, telling me he's still here." Mark felt a lump form in his throat, understanding now the depth of Laura's confusion and grief. Her battle with dementia, coupled with the shock of losing Charles, had driven her to escape the hospital, to return to her old home, seeking the comfort of her husband's presence. Gently, Mark asked, "Laura, do you remember anything about the accident?" Laura's eyes glistened as she nodded. "We were visiting the Tranquility Grove Memorial Garden," she began, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "It was always my favorite place, the winding stone paths lined with roses, lilies, and wildflowers. They change with the seasons, painting the garden with colors. The paths led to a pond with little bridges that connected the islands in the water. We'd sit on a bench there, listening to the trickling water, feeling peaceful." Her voice softened as she continued. "There's a large stone fountain, engraved with the words, 'In memory, there is life.' Every time we visited, Charles and I would toss a coin into that fountain and wish for our son's recovery." Her voice broke as she added, "That day, I insisted we go even though Charles wasn't well. I pushed too hard. I just wanted to make one more wish for our son to come home." Laura went on to explain how the garden had been closed when they arrived just before sunset. Charles, drowsy from his medication, had driven too fast towards the garden's gate. As Laura's story unfolded, Mark felt a profound sense of the tragedy that had befallen this family. The image of Laura and Charles making wishes for their troubled son in a beautiful garden contrasted sharply with the stark reality of the morgue and the knowledge of their son's current situation. Julia, who had been silent throughout this exchange, stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on Laura's shoulder. "Laura," she said softly, "I want you to know that you made a difference, not just in Alex's life but in so many others. You were there for children when they needed someone, and that counts for so much." Laura's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time there was a glimmer of something else in them. Gratitude, perhaps, or a flicker of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze moving between Julia and Mark. "Thank you for being here, for listening." The nurse gently informed them that visiting time was over, and Laura nodded, accepting it without resistance. They departed from the somber stillness of the morgue and walked back to Laura's hospital room. Once Laura was settled back into bed, Julia stepped forward, extending her business card with a soft smile. "Laura, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Alex would be happy to see you. He's grown up so much, but he still remembers you fondly." Laura clutched the card tightly, her voice faint but steady. "I would like that." Mark gently suggested that Laura consider moving to an elder care facility where she would be safe and cared for. Laura nodded in understanding, but made a simple request. "Before I go anywhere else, could you take me back to my house once I'm well enough, just to say goodbye to it properly?" Mark and Julia readily agreed, promising to visit her wherever she ended up. As a nurse entered to run more tests, Mark and Julia were excused to leave. They promised Laura they would visit again soon, their words filled with genuine care and commitment. In the quiet hospital corridor, Mark and Julia exchanged a knowing glance. Their anniversary had taken an unexpected turn, but amidst the chaos, they felt a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper connection that went beyond their original plans.